There we go. How you doing today? Today we are going to do something a little bit different to help you take your own memories and turn them into some great story. Now, typically in business, have you ever been in that position where you kind of need to draw on something because the point you want to make is just going to take a few seconds and you've been given the floor for 2 to 3 minutes? The easy way to take care of that is to create an example of your story, to create an example of your point with a story. Can you tell it's Saturday morning? Wake up! When you make a point and you kind of flesh it out with a story so people can see and understand the application, it strengthens everything. So today we're going to go over how to turn anecdotes into these wonderful things based on your stories. That's right. We're going to convert your memories, whether sketchy or not, into a great story that makes a difference. Okay, let's get started. Today we are going to have an experience where you have to deep dive into your memories of the past. That's right, you're going to have to rack your brain to figure out how to make this work. But when you do, you're going to be incredibly satisfied because you'll be able to tell a story that is remarkable and memorable. Not only memorable for your audience, but it's going to be memorable based on the lesson that you use. They'll hold on to that because of the anecdote. So let's get started with this here. The first point is that you have to engage your brain. Your brain has to be engaged. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So you have to start thinking through, okay, what's a past memory that I had that could be related to this issue that I'm discussing? You want to think about as many details as possible. For instance, what time did it happen? So as I go through this, I'm going to actually build a story from a memory. And I have not practiced this in advance. So this is real-time development so you can see how the process actually works. So I'm going to think back to a time when I was a little kid. I was in grade school, probably first or second grade. And the time of day it happened was an early Saturday morning. Where was I when it happened? Well, that's a good question. I was in the backyard playing. I had one of these little G.I. Joe type dolls, only it was called Captain America. And it had a cool parachute. And I could toss it up in the sky really high, and it would open up, and then I'd just watch it slowly float down. And it was the coolest sensation for a little kid. So I got smart. I climbed on top of the old garbage cans behind the garage. And back then, the garages were pretty small, and then they would build a little addition on when the cars got bigger. So they would jet out another 3 or 4 feet. So I climbed onto that little mini back roof, which was probably about this height today. But back then, I was a little guy, so it was a big climb. And I would stand on top of that roof, and I would hold the doll with the parachute ready to open, and I would toss it up high in the sky. And what would happen is that I would again watch it slowly floating down. It was marvelous. But then I saw, off out of the corner of my eye, the house. Now the house was a 3-story house basically. It had part of the basement was above ground, so about 4 or 5 feet above ground. Then it had a first floor, a second floor, and then there was an attic space. So it was a pretty tall house. And I thought, what if I got onto that roof and threw the doll off, and how would that parachute work? Now, I'm not going to finish the story yet because we have to finish going through these things. So that's where I was when it happened. I was in my yard. Now, what were my thoughts at that moment? Well, you could tell that my thought was something to do with the fact that I needed to extend the flight time of the parachute because it looked so cool coming down, and I didn't want to have to keep on throwing it up and throwing it up and throwing it up. So I wanted to get up really high and just stay there and just slowly float down for a much, much longer period of time. Now, keep in mind, I was 6 or 7 years old when this was going on. Okay, then the next question to ask ourselves is, who else was with me? Now, the story gets a little interesting here because I was pretty much alone in the backyard because it was so early on a Saturday morning. I was up and about playing in the backyard already. The sun was out. It was summertime. It was fantastic. What I didn't realize is that the neighbor lady was home and she was watching a little bit of my antics, but not yet. I'll get to that point in a bit. So the other person that was involved was the next door neighbor. Kind of like an angry, witchy type lady. That's who she was. Okay, now can I remember what I was wearing at the time? Well, I was wearing a pair of shorts, and I think I had, believe it or not, like a old Boy Scout shirt or something that was handed down to me from my cousins. Now, it was a long sleeve shirt and it was during the summertime. Yes, call me crazy, but that's what I wore because that's what I had. I rolled up the sleeves, of course, so it was a short sleeve shirt at that point. Now, once you've engaged your memory and all these things start flooding in, you need to go to your next step, and that's to be specific about the details. So you notice I talked about the shirt and rolling up the sleeves and things like that. If you're doing this for business, you don't want too many details because you could turn this into a 5-minute story easily. In business, you probably want it to be a 90-second story, maybe a 2-minute story. It all depends on the purpose of the story and what you're trying to do as far as engaging the audience. So some of the specificity that you can look into is anything dealing with our senses. You know, could you taste something? Could you smell something? Could you hear something? You know, what did you see? Most stories are visual stories, so you got to go on what you saw quite a bit. And then one of the other aspects is you want to just start to get a feeling for the emotional draw. Now, we'll talk about the big emotions later, but you want to kind of start to figure out how to relive that moment. Because the more you relive the moment as you gain into some of the specificity of the story, that's going to enrich the story and it's going to capture the people that are paying attention and watching you. So you definitely want to do that. Okay, so after being specific, you want to focus in on what is going to be that one big idea, that single point that I'm going to make in the points I'm trying to discuss in that part of my business presentation. Or if this is for a family story, that's fine too. But you typically want to make one single point. You want to make a point that everyone will understand and that is directly related to the story. Because after all, the story is your memory hook that's going to allow the people to remember what your point is. So what is one memory that connects with another memory so that you can move along and make multiple points in a business presentation? That's something you want to think about too. You know, typically you have 3 points you want to make. Do you have a story that's related or connected that you can bring out the points? Now, in my case, all my stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning, I'm talking about being behind the garage and tossing the doll up and so on. In the middle, that starts off when I realize that there's a much taller roof if I climb onto the roof of the house. Now, the middle of that story is going to be the memories dealing with looking out my bedroom window, and there was only a little roof ledge just this big outside of my window, and could I stand on it or would I fall 2 stories to the ground? That's some pretty intense stuff for a little 6 or 7 year old to be thinking about. But I noticed that once you get past the window about 2 feet, then you got the entire expanse of the roof, although the roof was incredibly steep. So anyway, you can see where the second part of the story is going, and those memories are a little bit different because those memories were about fear, where the beginning memories were about the fun and the thrill of seeing this parachute, Captain Marvel coming down on a parachute. So by having two different emotional tones, and again, we'll get into emotional tones in a little bit, but by having that, you bring a lot of interest to your story. Now, as I'm pulling these together, and I'm not going to get to the third part yet, but we'll get there. As I'm pulling these together, I say, what is that common thread that keeps them all together? You know, certainly I'm on this adventure. Certainly I'm trying to explore things from the standpoint of how can I accomplish this goal? For me, the story today would be about the fact that you need to make your story emotional. But for you, maybe it's the fact that you need to calculate risks before you move forward. Whatever the story might be, you will need to think through and find what that single idea is going to be. Then we move on to the fact that you have to keep the story personal. It has to be near and dear to your heart in some way, shape, or form. It has to really draw the audience in and cause them to understand a little bit about who you are. Okay, now some of you are thinking, okay, this guy is pretty crazy. As the little kitty climbed up on his roof. Yeah, I was a creative type. I hadn't been taught fear yet. So I saw no problem in climbing up on the roof. Anyway, some of the things that you can think about to help keep your story personal is what was your reaction, back when the event happened. And not only the reaction, and by the way, I will tell you my reaction, when I started climbing out onto the roof, the lady next door saw me and she starts yelling at the top of her lungs, and it scared me, and I slipped and I fell, but I grabbed onto the part of the kind of the windowsill area, and I was dangling. I got my feet up underneath me, and I realized that, oh my gosh, this woman who had fear about the moment, was just so angry she didn't want to see me fall. But instead of being nice and kind and trying to encourage me to get back to safety, she screamed and shouted and said she was going to call the police, and she got all angry. And that made me nervous and difficult, and I was losing my footing, and I realized that I was not in a safe place because of her, not because of the steepness of the roof. Isn't that interesting how the way we approach things can change a person's perspective? So see there, as I'm keeping it personal, I can come up with some other points that I can use the story for in a different setting. So as we build these anecdotes, that's the kind of thing that's going to happen. You're going to see other ways of relating to them. Now, at that point, you have to think through what would happen next in this story. Should the little guy climb back in the window? Will she call the police for real? Especially since my dad was a cop, would he be the one to answer the call? Could you imagine? The punishment. Or did I decide, look, I'm already out on the roof. I've already risked things. I've survived so far. I'm going to climb to the peak of the roof and at least toss the guy out one time so I can watch him sail down. And that is what I did. I climbed out on the roof. It was slippery. She was yelling like crazy. I got to the very peak of the roof, which was like 35, 40 feet high in the air. I walked to the edge of the roof on the peak. I took my character down and I went, whoo! And I threw it as high as I could throw it. It poofed open. I started watching it come down, and it was incredible. Absolutely incredible. Then I started to slowly come down, and she was more fierce. She was outside. Her cigarette was hanging off of her lip as she was spitting juices out of her mouth, yelling at me. And she was so distracting, I slipped and I started sliding down the shingles toward the gutters. And I thought I was a goner. But just then, I saw on the side of the dorm, kind of the dormer area, a little piece of flange had been opened up a little bit. And I grabbed it, and it stopped me from falling off the roof. I then climbed back up, shifted over to the window, climbed in, closed the window, closed the drapes, and I sat on my bed hoping that she wouldn't call the police. Okay, so how does it feel to remember that? You want to ask yourself, from a personal standpoint, what was that moment like? Well, for me, I just remember how evil and mean that woman was and how she almost cost me my life twice. I never thought that I was actually in danger until she came along. Interesting perspective. But as a little kid, you're limited in how you can think, and that element can be used in multiple stories. Then you also want to ask yourself, do I have a different perspective thinking back in time than what maybe I actually had in the moment? Now, this is a tough one to ask yourself because a lot of times it's the emotion that we remember more than the specifics. For instance, did she really start yelling at me as I was climbing out of the window? Or did it only happen when I was trying to come down from the roof and trying to climb back into the window? Was it both or was it just one? You have to decide that for yourself. Memories are a funny thing. We hold on to them in different ways. And scientists say that our the sounds or the tastes or things like that is stored in a different place than the visuals or what we heard. Those are kind of stored separately in our brain. So our brain has to kind of pull them all together to rebuild that memory for you to relive it. What's even more interesting is that if we start to embellish the story over and over, sometimes we rewrite the story because the only one we can remember is the embellished one instead of the actual one. But don't worry about that. The point of your story, the point of using that memory, is to help people remember the main point you're about to make. Whatever that point is, that is why you're using it. Now, in telling your story, you want to look for some kind of a surprise moment or element that you can use. You want to, if your story is going from here along the line to here, people see it coming. As they're moving along, maybe take a turn down here and then go back over here. You want something to help the people to not know what's next. Get them on the edge of their seat so they're trying to think through, okay, how is this going to work exactly? Now, to do that, I like to think through a series of questions, and a couple of them I've put on the board here. Why did I do the thing that made me so angry? Now, in my case, why did I do the thing that made me so fearful? What was interesting was I didn't have fear about the entire thing until the next door lady started yelling at me and threatening me with calling the police. That's when I had fear. Otherwise, I was just going to climb out on the roof, walk to the top, throw the doll off, come back inside, go downstairs, grab the doll, go upstairs, climb on the roof, do it again. I only did it one time because that woman scared the bejeebus out of me, and I almost fell off the roof as a result of her. What could have happened if this memory didn't happen? In other words, is this a story that I would have gone after to make the point in my business presentation. If we were talking about safety lines, having a safety line on you, talking about this story would cause people to think, yeah, there's a reason for safety lines. Maybe I'm trying to do a talk about electronic components, and I have to figure out, does the story attach or does it not attach? Whatever that case might be for you, as you're going through that process, you want to think through, what if these elements didn't quite happen the way they did? Could I tell the story a little bit differently for the sake of making my point? Here's the thing. Some people are like, no, you have to always tell the truth in your story. Well, our memories think we're telling the truth, but sometimes you make some little minor alterations. Sorry, wrong word. Although that'd be an interesting twist in the plot. If she would have come up on the roof with me, and that would have been interesting. The point being, you want to be able to think through things and say, are there adjustments in the story I can make to strengthen my point? Now, at that point, you don't want to say, here's a true story that happened to me, exactly as I remember it. You don't want to do that. But you can still talk about, aspects of, you can say, my memory's a little shaky about something, but I thought this is an interesting point you'd want to hear about. You can build it in any way you want. The point is that you want to do it so that you can clearly get to the point that you want to be making. Now, you have to make the story visual. A must. Visual, make it visual. Even this story is visual. I have words up on the screen for you. But more importantly, when I told you the story, you probably could picture it. For instance, you can ask yourself things like, okay, what kind of colors did I see? Well, I could have talked about the Captain America doll and how it had, black and dark navy blue costume and a little rubbery hat with silver trim. And the parachute that opened up had a big Captain America logo in bright orange that just could be seen for blocks away. There's a lot of things from a detailed color standpoint that will help you to remember that story. Or, if I'm talking about the roofing experience and how my kids' tennis shoes started to slip and I fell to my knee and I could feel the little stones in the shingles cut into my skin. There's a lot of things there that you can do. Now, as far as shapes and patterns, that can help too, because you can actually use those tools symbolically throughout the rest of your instruction. And then the sounds. The entire time that I told the story, I didn't really talk about many sounds. But I could have, as I'm falling down the roof and hearing the little, what do you call those gritty pebble things peeling off of the shingles as I slid down, making a grinding sound toward the gutter, and then grabbing that flange and hearing the metal creak open. Those are things that enhance the story. Or when I talk about throwing the parachute high up into the air and it popping open, or the wind catching it and filling it. There's things like that you can do. Now, believe it or not, I was on a fairly busy street back when I was a little kid, so I could have talked about the traffic going by, wondering how many people driving by were going to call the cops. There's a 6-year-old on the building. Anyway, so you want to do the sounds, you want to do the sights. Now, here's an interesting question. What was the temperature of my memory when I experienced it originally? Okay, so what I'm talking about here is an emotional temperature. Not talking about the weather, although the weather was gorgeous. It was in the 70s. It was a sunny, bright summer day. Plenty dry, so I wasn't worried about slipping. But when we're talking about the temperature of it, you can almost see that in the beginning of the story it's light and it's airy and everything is wonderful, and then it gets a little risky as I'm climbing on the garbage cans up onto that little partial platform roof on the garage. But I made it without any problems. Getting down was a little bit harder, and I could have talked about the sound of the crinking or the crunching of the garbage cans as I was stepping up. But then when you see the house, the 3-story house, and you decide, that's where I'm going. Now you got a different temperature. Remember when I was out and slipping on the roof? Now we're talking about fear. It wasn't lighthearted at all. It was, precarious at best. And then the verbal attacks, enough to shake anyone. Those things really make a big difference in how we tell our story. So after making it visual, finally, we get to the most important part. It has to be emotional. You have to find the emotion of the story. It's been said many, many, many times, and I'm not even sure who quoted it or who said it first or anything else. But basically, when it comes to that story, people are going to remember a story a lot longer than the facts in business that you share. Business facts, they say that if you share today, by tomorrow you're only going to remember 15% of it. If you don't review it, you just remember only 15%. By the next day, you'll only remember 15% of what you remembered on that first day. If you review the stuff, you can extend it out a week or two, but that's it. When you use a story to make your point, people can remember it far longer, anywhere up to several years later. They can still remember the point. The more emotional your story is, the longer they remember that point. You see, when we have an emotional event, our memory kicks in and grabs that information and it holds it. Your mind can't tell if it was a story that was emotional that you watched or that you heard or that you experienced. Your mind cannot distinguish it. It just takes that information, and the higher the emotional appeal, the higher memory capability you have of whatever was taught in that moment. That's just the way we're wired. So you want to say to yourself, when you're looking into your story, how did I feel after that memory? After that moment in time? How did I feel? And what was that roller coaster of emotions that I went on? And now, how do I feel about that memory in retrospect as I start to relive that moment? The next question would be, how does it feel now when you think back after so long? In other words, pretty much what I had just said, but I'm adding on this after so long part because that's the critical thing. If you can still relive the moment, there's a huge emotional part in the story that you can take advantage of when you retell the story. If there's not that huge emotional piece, you have to search for one, think back as best as you can to figure out how to attach one in case you had lost it. For instance, when my dad told me about the story when he was out as a cop, and the fire department and the police were called to this woman's house because she was trapped in her bathtub. How can you be trapped in a bathtub? But she was trapped. She couldn't get out of her tub. They all came in. Picture these 2 police officers and 4 firemen cramming in around this woman's bathtub. And there she is, not a stitch of clothing on, sitting in the bathtub, and she couldn't get out. And they grabbed her and pulled her and yanked her. One grabbed the leg, another grabbed an arm, another grabbed from behind the shoulders. Nobody could pull her out. It was just a disaster. And yet here's these proud fire department guys and a couple cops, and they're like, guys, we have to be able to figure this out. They were so into trying to solve the problem that it never dawned on them to give the lady a towel to cover up. They weren't thinking anything like that at all. They were just thinking of the mechanics of how do we get her out of the bathtub. The bottom line of this story was kind of interesting because she was enjoying her bath so much that she decided to just stay in the tub until all the water drained out. But because the water had drained out, her skin suctioned up against the side of the tub and sealed her so that they couldn't get her out of the tub. So finally, one of the cops is like, guys, why don't we just refill the tub and see what happens? So they turned on the water. The tub filled up. She climbed out on her own, and everything was fine. I was laughing hysterically at the dinner table when my dad shared that story because it was a true story. But the key was, in thinking back on it, it was the humorous moment of it that allowed me to remember that story. I only heard him tell the story once. And this is decades later that I'm sharing this story because of the humor that was tied to it. So your emotions could be humor, it could be fear, it could be anger, it could be joy, it could be any kind of emotion. As long as the audience feels that sense of emotion, they're going to remember your point. Whew, that's a lot. So if you take all of these different elements and you put them together, you can take your memory, you can structure it as a regular story. You have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The climax has to hit somewhere in the end, and a point has to come from that ending that directly relates to the point that you're making in your story. And there you have it, how to turn a memory into a wonderful anecdote that you can use for years to come. Have a great day.